Under Premier League rules, football clubs are allowed to lose no more than £105 million over 3 years. Loss is calculated as income less costs. So the allegations which have been made against Manchester City is, first of all, when it comes to their income, they have manipulated the income by overstating it. And in particular, what they've done is the owner has given the club money, and Manchester City have disguised this as sponsorship income. Now, if the owner normally gives the club money, it doesn't count as income. Under these circumstances, it is being counted as income. So therefore, that's allowed Manchester City to go out into the transfer market to pay higher wages for talented managers, coaches and players, which it wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. The second allegation is that we said that profit or loss is income less costs. Well, in terms of costs, that Manchester City has deliberately understated their costs. And they've done this through things such as, let's say that we've got a coach, a good coach who's worth 5 million. Manchester City pay the coach 3 million. And somebody else connected to the owner, a club in the country, in UAE, in Abu Dhabi, has been paying the coach £2 million, but he's only been there for sort of 2 days of the year. So he's effectively being paid for a no-show job. If anybody's old enough, they'll remember that Tony Soprano did this in the wonderful series, The Sopranos. And that means that if you inflate your income and you deflate your costs, you can stay within the £105 million limit, but it gives you a competitive advantage because you're effectively being allowed to employ better players, recruit better staff, and still stay within the rules.
So,
well, ultimately, the responsibility for the decisions made by a company lie with the board of directors. So they are the executives, they are the C-level staff, the chief executive, the chief financial officer, the chief marketing director. And therefore, you would have to ask, A, were they aware of what was happening? And B, if they were not aware, why not? Because you get the benefits of being an executive in terms of decision making and financial reward. Then that should come with the downside as well in terms of being held responsible for the decisions of the company. So the owners not necessarily from a legal point of view, because as shareholder you are independent of the company itself, although if there are close links, quite often the two parties are the same, then it could be that certainly the reputation of the directors and the owners would take a huge hit if these allegations are proven to be true. Well, that's a really difficult one because A, we've not seen the evidence. B, we don't know how many charges, if any at all, upon which Manchester City would be found guilty. In terms of there's a lot of politics in English football. I think that the preferred punishment would be for a points deduction, because the argument would be that if it was just a financial punishment, given the wealth of the owners, given that it is effectively a sovereign wealth fund, which is the benefactors of Manchester City, that a financial penalty would not actually particularly harm the club. So therefore, you need to do something which would be seen within football itself as being a punishment, and also acting as a deterrent should any other clubs with equally benevolent owners decide to consider a similar action. I agree entirely with you. If we were talking about Southampton, if we were talking about Brentford, if we were talking about a small club like Crystal Palace, you and I would not be having this conversation. It's because it is Manchester City who have won the Premier League for 4 years out of the last 5, who have reached the Champions League final, who have spent around about $1.3 billion in building their squad, that we're having this conversation. And there is jealousy, there is resentment, there is envy. and there's not a lot of admiration because football doesn't operate like that. Football is a very, very snarky business where everybody's trying to put the other clubs down.
And issues.
Well, I think Juventus's situation was slightly different in the sense that Juventus is a listed company on the Italian stock market, and therefore they are held to a higher standard of behaviour than is the case for a private company. And in the case of Juventus, some of the accusations was that the club was paying players and therefore deceiving the stock market with the level of profits and losses that it was reporting. And that has an impact upon investment decisions. So I think there is a difference here, although given that around about 17% of Manchester City is now owned by the American investment fund Silver Lake, I would imagine that they will be observing and reviewing their position with a great deal of care and watching how things proceed once the commission starts and yes, as it moves towards its conclusions. Well, on the face of things, it looks very strange. But then when you delve into it, I think it's fair to say that Chelsea have exploited the existing rules and have taken them to a new dimension. So under the rules for football, and this is most important when it comes to football player trading, when you sell a player, all of the profit goes into your calculations immediately. But when you buy a player, the cost of buying the player is spread over the player's contract via a process that the accountants call amortization. So what Chelsea have done is that they've just put players on extremely long contracts. So if you sign a player for $100 million, they'd normally be on, say, a 4-year contract. So you say, well, 100 divided by 4, that gives me a cost of 25 million a year. What Chelsea have done is they've put them on 8-year contracts. So 100 divided by 8 gives a cost of $12.5 million a year. So can you see, if you do this 6 or 7 times, you can save yourself somewhere in the region of $70 to $80 million of costs in a single season. And given that the losses are 105 million sterling over 3 years, that impact can be significant. The downside to what Chelsea have done is that they've assumed that all of these players are going to be a success. If they're not a success, what are you going to do for the next 6 or 7 seasons when you've got a player who's being paid a salary that nobody else is prepared to match, but you've got a legal obligation? You've signed a contract to commit to pay that wages. So if the players are great, it will be a fantastic return for Chelsea. If the players turn out to be not so great, they're going to have a huge legacy of unwanted inventory, which doesn't particularly want to go anywhere because the players don't want to take pay cuts. And then you've got a problem. Well, certainly we have seen some clubs in terms of the financial submissions that they've made make fairly significant claims as to the impact, for example, that COVID had on their finances, and they've claimed that COVID cost them money in a myriad of ways, some of which have certainly raised eyebrows as far as observers are concerned. So if Manchester City are charged, you would think that Manchester City would say to the Premier League, well, you've investigated us and charged us, then surely you have a responsibility to do this for other clubs as well. If the Premier League don't do that, it could be seen that they're trying to make a scapegoat of Manchester City, who are unpopular with certain other elements of the English football establishment because they represent new money, and old money doesn't like new money in all aspects of life. In all, it doesn't have to be sport, and therefore you can understand why there's likely to perhaps be an enthusiasm for this to move on, and that's going to be bad news for football as a whole, because then it becomes who's got the best lawyers and the best accountants, as opposed to who's got the best strikers and centre halves and midfield players.
Yeah, and